Grazie Fabrizio. Buongiorno.
It's in Italian.
Yeah, of course, of course. I was gonna start talking in Greek, but no. So thank you all for coming to the talk. As Fabrizio pointed out, so I'm Kapralos, and I'm a professor at what is now known as the Ontario Tech University, and it used to be called the University of Ontario Institute of Technology, which is a very long name. They decided to change it 15 years later. So the university itself, it's just outside of Toronto. Has anyone been to Canada here? Okay, there's good opportunity, that means. Well, yeah, I mean, there's good opportunities. You can come visit. Who wants to visit Canada? All the hands should go up. Come on. I mean, just visit. You don't have to live there. You just visit.
I told you many people from here that wants to get there.
You know, if you ask me, I want to come here, but yeah, it's a little different. So there's about 10,000 students, undergraduate, graduate, maybe a little bit more now. Close to 11,000, but the emphasis is on technology. We're a relatively new university. We're about 15 or 16 years old. I've been there for about 13 years. And we have some very innovative programs. We have a nuclear engineering program. We're the first in Canada, I believe in Canada, to have an undergraduate nuclear engineering program. We have automotive engineering. We work with GM, which is very similar to you guys. We have one of the biggest wind tunnels in the world on campus. But we also have game development, and I'm actually in the game development program. And game development is a lot more than just playing games, right? I mean, there's a lot of work in there, a lot of PR and what have you, as I'll point out later. So yeah, this is the campus. It's a really nice campus. I mean, Canada has like a lot of nice beauty, nature, and what have you in general. I want to actually thank Fabrizio for having me here, and Polytechnical for supporting my visit here as part of an external examiner for a PhD defense. As Fabrizio pointed out, we've been collaborating for a number of years now. I met him actually here. I was here for a conference, and it just happened. I got an email from someone in my university in the research office, and they asked me if I wanted to meet some people from the Polytechnical. And actually, I was here, so I did, and it happened to be Fabrizio and some of the colleagues. But nonetheless, during these past few years, we've had a couple of students that have come over to Canada to work for an about 4 or 5 months. And they've done some really good work. And I'm going to point out some of the work that they've done as the talk progresses. Luca and Severo in particular. Was there another one from Pizza, or was it just Luca and Severo? Yeah. So, I mean, their work has resulted in some publications at conferences and what have you. So, and the students really like the experience. And one thing I tell students, kind of veer off from the talk, but one thing I tell students is, I mean, you guys are in a position right now that you don't understand. It's hard to comprehend. You have opportunities. And what you should do as a student, take advantage of those opportunities. Go out, explore the world. I mean, obviously, you're studying, but the students that come to Canada, aside from the fact that they're interacting and meeting other people, other students, faculty members, they're also seeing Canada, and they're seeing things that, they won't necessarily, I mean, these things can shape them for the rest of their lives, right? So, as an undergrad, when I went to a conference once, actually as a master's student, starting out my master's, and I met someone there. He was also a master's student at another university in Germany. And 15, 20 years later, he's a faculty member at one of the universities in Canada, Simon Fraser. And we collaborate and we talk. But I met him at a conference as a student. So you don't know where life is going to take you, who you're going to meet, and where those connections lead to. Okay, so in terms of, you haven't been to Canada, right now in Canada, or at least in Toronto, it's very nice. There's nice weather. It's actually, the summers are beautiful. It gets hot, even humid too. But not too long ago, this is what we had. You don't want to come in, well, maybe you do want to come in the winter, but I don't. I want to leave in the winter. You're welcome to come, but it gets cold. It gets very cold. And, Severio and Luca, they spent the brunt of the winter there in January, February, and they were cold. But, they liked it. It was an experience. And I remember telling them that, I'll ask you if you come the second time, if you like it or not. So the first time is always good, right? But, okay. Okay, so enough of that. I want to get into the talk now, and I'm going to spend some time introducing immersive technologies. I'll give some examples, some of the work that I've done, some of the work that other people have done. I don't want to focus solely on my own work. I want to make this more of an overview of the field, talk about some problems in the field while talking about my work too. So before we start, there's this fear of technology, and of course not with you guys. I mean, you're all in technology-based programs, so you probably don't fear technology, probably like technology and embrace it. But going back to ancient Greece, Socrates, the philosopher, he basically said, "This discovery of yours will create forgetfulness in the learner's souls, because they will not use their memories. They will trust to the external written characters and not remember of themselves." He was referring to the stylus, which is essentially a pen. Okay? And at the time, when you're going back 2,500 years ago, that was the modern technology. It was a pen. You never had pens. You'd have Socrates or the philosophers, and you'd have the students seated around them, and they would profess, they would talk, and the students would listen. And all of a sudden, the stylus came in, and they started taking notes. And Socrates feared that would inhibit their learning, ultimately, their remembering of what he said. Fast forward a couple thousand years, Conrad Gessner, information overload must regulate the trade so the public won't suffer with confusing and harmful abundance of books. He was a printing presses he ran, and he was scared of books. He thought books would kind of ruin learning and what have you. So, this fear of technology is not new. And even more recently, this is great because this was on CNN. Whatever you think of CNN, people read it. CNN, email hurts IQ more than pot. So, and there was a Telegraph article by UK. Twitter and Facebook could harm moral values. Perhaps they're not wrong, I don't know. And Facebook and MySpace, which is a few years old, a generation cannot form relationships. Again, maybe they're not too right about, or not wrong about that, and how using Facebook could raise your risk of cancer. Okay, so some really interesting things here. Is Google making us stupid? You can argue either way, but the point is, this is technology and things progress. Yet there's a fear, whether it's Google and perhaps it's the older generation that's saying, well, Google's making students dumb and this and that. But perhaps it creates opportunities. And right now you have information at your fingertips. And if you want to see something and learn about something, you get it. So that's not a bad thing, in my opinion. And just something to consider, this is Marshall McLuhan. He's a Canadian philosopher, very prominent Canadian. Anyone who tries to make a distinction between education and entertainment doesn't know the first thing about either. Okay? So this is going to lead into the talk. And when we're talking about, because I'm going to talk about using games for learning and training, there's no reason why education cannot be fun. We've been kind of ingrained, it's been ingrained in us that, education is serious and you can't laugh, you can't have fun. Professor writes on the board, you listen, you take notes. It doesn't have to be like that. And in fact, that's actually a very poor way of learning. There's much more, because you're not engaged, it's not interactive, it's not immersive. So with that quote, does anyone disagree with this? You can disagree, it's okay. Yeah, just making sure. Bad things would happen if you did. Not for me, for Fabrizio. So immersive tech. So what is immersive technology? Can anyone tell me what immersive tech is, or immersive technology, immersive tech? You guys should all know, come on. Give me an example of immersive tech. Virtual reality, exactly. Anyone else? How about augmented reality? Yeah. Anything else? No? So let me just backtrack here. If we look at immersive, let's step back. Simulation. Who can tell me what simulation is? Or give me an example of simulation, aside from what I have here. Well, who flies on a plane? Who's been in a plane? You know where your pilot is trained? A flight simulator, exactly. So it's basically recreating the real world, or not necessarily the real world, but in flight simulators, recreating the real world. You're creating a model and you're practicing on that model, mimicking what happens in the real world. And if you don't believe in simulation, then, I mean, pilots are a great example. They're learning in flight simulators. They don't get on a plane and learn on a plane. That would be they used to back in the, when planes, back, First and Second World War, that's how they were training. But that's a very dangerous way to train, right? It's not very safe. A good example of flight simulators, landing in fog. So this was a real problem. Pilots could not land the planes in fog, decades ago. And then with the advent of flight simulators, they started mimicking or simulating landing in fog scenarios. And all of a sudden now, there's no crash. Well, there may be the odd one, but generally, pilots don't crash with landing in the fog. And that's all thanks in part to flight simulators. So simulation, it's been around for a long time. Pilots are, it's probably the best, most known example. Pilots train with flight simulators. This is an early one, the Link Trainer, early 1900s. The NASA Moon project, they were using simulation to practice and train for the landing and being on the moon. In medicine, simulation is a tried and tested way. It actually goes back to the 1600s with midwifery, training with giving birth. And of course, if you look at currently in medicine, we have these simulation mannequins that are very realistic, and they talk and they do all kinds of things and behave as humans do. Current emphasis, however, and I'll talk about this again as I progress, is on virtual. So we're replacing these physical simulators, or sometimes we augment the physical with the virtual, but we're moving into virtual worlds. And if you look at just as an example, the U.S. military, and I'm not arguing any military or anything like that, but they have been big proponents of virtual simulation and gaming and training for decades, since the 80s, since games have come about. And currently they're investing a lot of money, tens of millions of dollars in virtual simulations and creating these frameworks and platforms and something like that. So if we go into immersive tech, and it's related to simulation, obviously, and I'll make that connection, we can define immersive tech as technology that blurs the line between the physical world and the digital or simulated world, thereby creating a sense of immersion. And I took that from Wikipedia. It's not my definition. I generally don't like to quote Wikipedia, but this was a good one. And of course, the key here is immersion. Okay, so immersion, putting yourself in the world. Can anyone give me a good example of immersion, non-technical?
When playing sports.
Sports, yeah, you're caught in the moment, you forget about everything else. How about reading? Who reads books? Like physical books, comic books, watching a movie perhaps. Those are examples, that's what immersion is. When you get caught up, when you get a book, you open it, you start reading it, and you can't put it down. You're immersed, right? You're caught up in the world, you forget about everything else. Well, that's exactly what the key is with immersive technology, immersion. So augmented reality and virtual reality, those are examples of immersive tech. And coupled with serious gaming, or that is games that are used for education and training, and I'll talk about that shortly, you can lead to very engaging learning applications, immersive and engaging learning experiences, and you can recreate a lot of things. And it's fun. It's a lot of fun. So now students are no longer sitting where you guys are now, just like I'm here talking to you, but they're actually part of the learning. They're an active component of the learning process. Keep in mind that immersive technologies, even though now we look at AR and VR, and it's a relatively new thing, especially when Facebook purchased or acquired Oculus for $2.5 billion or whatever it was. That kind of brought everything to light, but it's been around much longer than that. It goes back to the 50s with the Sensorama, and if you see here, you have this, it mimicked, I think, a motorcycle ride or whatever it was. You had fans blowing air on you, and you had slides, picture slides that moved, and you created this kind of experience of riding a motorcycle, when in fact you weren't actually on a motorcycle riding on the road. Back in the 80s, VR was a huge thing in the 80s. NASA did a lot of work with virtual reality to train pilots and what have you. Of course, the problem was that the technology at the time was nowhere near where we are today. So you had virtual reality headsets that were, these big, we call them buckets. And you put these things on, because I've used them when I was a student, and you get a headache after a couple minutes. So they just weren't comfortable. The resolution was very poor, and a whole bunch of other things. So why all the hype recently? Well, I mentioned Facebook acquiring Oculus, and there's been some cool things that have come about. Basically a lot of it comes down to and as I pointed out, back in the 80s, you had these big cumbersome headsets that needed very big computers to run, which, wasn't practical for the average person to have. So recently there's been an increase in computational power, a decrease in the size of electronic components. Things have gotten faster and much smaller and much cheaper as a result too. And basically this has led to the availability of consumer level immersive technologies and VR headsets in particular, and a whole bunch of other things as well. And so now they're available for a relatively, well, I won't say cheap, but relatively cheap price. I mean, you can have Google Cardboard for a couple dollars. And this has helped advance recent adoption of virtual simulation, hand-on tracking technologies using controllers such as Elite Motion, hand sensors, Microsoft Kinect, a whole bunch of other things. So aside from just the viewing experience, all of a sudden now we're creating more realistic experiences because we're looking at interaction. We're allowed to create or recreate how we interact in the real world. It's not perfect yet, there's a lot of work to be done, but I can gesture. I mean, when I'm talking to you, I'm using my hands, I'm gesturing. I can recreate all that. Sign language, just as an example. I mean, you can do all that now. We have technology that lets us do it. So a big part of immersive technologies is that interaction. It's the interaction part, how we interact with the virtual world. And a big part of that was also who has the Kinect, or not the Kinect, I'm sorry, the Nintendo Wii. So you guys remember when that came out a number of years ago, the big hype about that? So what was so good about that? Like prior to the Wii, we had these first-person shooters that, everything was on high, fidelity graphics, right? We had these amazing graphics. The Nintendo Wii came about. Is that high fidelity? Is that really quality graphics? No, I mean, it's not. You can't argue that. But what was the difference? So why was the Wii so popular? That, not only were young or male adolescents, but females, older people, or parents, were playing video games because of the Wii. Why is that?
Because of the Wiimote.
The Wiimote, the interaction, right? So the focus moved away from graphics and realistic, visual scenes to interaction, and that was fun. That was It's engaging, and that's really where things have moved since then. Focus has been on interaction and not so much the high fidelity graphics as they once were. Okay? And that's really brought gaming and all this technology, not only gaming, but all this technology to the masses. You looked at the Nintendo Wii was put in old age homes, and it brought the elderly together. They would be very solitary. All of a sudden, they were brought together. At least in the U.S., I'm sure it's the same in Europe too. They were brought together and they were playing bowling or whatever they were doing and having fun together. Okay? So, focus is on interaction, and there's a whole bunch of things you can do. So again, it's really the devices that provide more natural and immersive interactions, and they help overcome the limitations associated with traditional keyboard and mouse-based computer interactions. So if I have this virtual world, I have this headset on me, and I'm interacting with a mouse and a keyboard, it's not very realistic. It's very limiting, actually. Aside from the realistic part, it's very limiting because now I can't use my hands. I can't, if I'm simulating surgery, I can't go in and cut with a scalpel. I have to do it all with my mouse and keyboard. So now we have the tech to let us do some really cool stuff, and hence, it's taken off. So, really the tech where we are today, and again, it's always improving, and it's by no means perfect. There's a lot of issues, but it's providing designers and developers of virtual sims and games in general great freedom to develop highly immersive applications. The VR industry in 2015 was estimated to be globally 1.37 billion US. And by 2022, it's expected to be 33.9 billion, so it's growing. Goldman Sachs in 2016, they talked about AR and VR being a $95 billion industry by 2025. That was back in 2017. I mean, is it going to be there? It's definitely moving up. Will it reach 95 billion by 2025? Perhaps not, but nonetheless, it's moving positive. So, what is driving these advances? So, where's this money coming from? And up until recently, it's been games. Gaming was driving the VR industry. Okay. But this is quickly changing, and really, gaming is kind of falling down. It's kind of going down. Problem is that if you look at VR right now, it's very solitary, right? I mean, you put on the headset, and there's very little interaction going on with anyone else. If you look at, a lot of times you interact with games, and so that's one of the issues. And that's not me saying that. There's been work published on that. But nonetheless, it's moving into training. Okay, so this whole immersive tech, VR, AR type thing is really moving into training. And it has been suggested that VR and AR will drive a revolution in medical education and patient care. And it's expected to play a large role under the following health applications: education and training, surgical planning, telemonitoring, patient experience, treatment and therapies, AR-enhanced surgery and patient care. In Canada and in the US, collectively, North America in general, this is a real big thing. And I imagine it's the same in Europe. I can't speak specifically for Italy, but I would imagine it's very similar. There's a lot of resources, a lot of money, and a lot of work being done into incorporating VR tech in general in the medical profession. And that's for medical education and patient care. I'm actually involved in a lot of the work in plenty of work in this domain. And I can tell you that, I do a lot of work with a number of hospitals in Canada, and people like you that have the skills that do this stuff are in high demand. Okay, so, we have a gaming program at my university, and really, obviously a big driving, job, the career is in the game industry. But there's a whole other area that students are wanted in its areas as VR development for medicine. You have hospitals that are taking our students and hiring them as interns, for example, and they're still students and they're hiring them as interns for the summer and doing some really cool work on medical education or even patient care and what have you. So, yeah, why is that the case? Well, because VR and AR there's a number of reasons why this is happening in medicine. Medicine in Canada, as it is throughout the world, is very expensive. And I'm talking about medical care, medical training. It's extremely expensive. Okay? And VR and AR is showing promise to be a very cost-effective alternative. Okay? It's not going to replace traditional training with the mannequins and what have you, but it's going to complement. Okay? These sim labs, the labs where I showed those mannequins, they're extremely expensive. Having a lab with a number of these mannequins can cost $100,000 to $200,000. They're extremely expensive, and it's one thing to buy them, but you have to maintain them. They're also expensive to maintain, and you need these large spaces to house them in with extensive equipment and what have you. So these spaces are limited. We have a limited number of spaces, and therefore they're very expensive. So one thing we can do is, before we have trainees going into these labs, we can prepare them with virtual reality. They can be prepared so that when they're in the space, they can make better use of the time that they're in there instead of learning basic things that they should know anyways. Okay? So it offers trainees the opportunity to safely and cost efficiently train until they reach a specific competency level. It's very convenient. As a trainee, I can be at home and I can practice. I mean, I can be sitting on the couch and play my work on an app and practice. So I mean, it's very flexible. Team training, users can be located anywhere. You can train teams. I can be here and somebody can be in Canada, and we can be working together. There's also some really interesting studies, like laparoscopic surgeons. They operate their manipulators by looking at a 2D screen. They're inside the body, looking at a 2D screen, navigating and performing tasks by looking at a monitor. They actually make less errors. Those that play video games are more accurate in their surgeries. This was a study that was done at, I think it was Mount Sinai in New York. And basically this led to, it's because of the fact that video games help you develop hand-eye coordination. There's also an interesting study out of New York, I think it was the same hospital, where they took a group of kids that play video games, adolescents that play video games, and they looked at, and they also took laparoscopic surgeons. And what they did was they had them perform some hand-eye coordination tasks. And what they found was that the kids, I'll say kids, adolescents, performed equally as well as the laparoscopic surgeons with respect to those hand-eye coordination tasks. Now, of course, it's not to say that these kids can be surgeons, obviously not. I mean, or they could if they train enough, but it just shows you that playing video games builds hand-eye coordination. Right now, though, for the most part, we're fairly limited in terms of the applications that we have. We're limited to cognitive skills training. So, in other words, looking at decision making. What are the steps that I need to take to perform a surgery? And I did some work with knee replacement. We developed a sim back in 2010 for knee replacement, to go through the knee replacement. And the process itself is 100 and something steps that you have to follow. Each step has tools and things you have to do. And it's a very complicated task, obviously. So the surgeons that I was working with, they mentioned that the students, the trainees, the orthopedic surgery trainees would come into the operating room. They were given a big manual to read, or a textbook to read about the procedure, and they would not read it. So they'd come into the operating room and they'd be ill-prepared. So the surgeon, the trainer, would have to spend a lot of time going over basic steps. So we developed this sim to take care of those basic steps. And what we found was, I don't have actually a video of it, this was fairly older work, but we ran some studies with it, and what we found was that it was indeed effective, and it worked for the novice trainees. And that's what we expected. And it was actually better, the results were better for the trainees that trained on the sim versus the ones that were given the textbook, because they didn't read the textbook. So, the current buzz, again, virtual and augmented reality. It's all about virtual and augmented reality. Computing speed has increased tremendously, and computers have become much smaller, as I pointed out. And I'll just show this. This is some work we did with the HoloLens. And we recreated this operating room. It's actually an actual operating room at one of the hospitals in Toronto. And this is Luca. He actually used that, and he did some work with this. I'll talk about his work shortly. He added some interactions, hand tracking, motion tracking of the arm with the HoloLens. So he actually came to Canada for, I think it was 4 or 5 months, I can't remember. But he did really great work. He learned so much, very good student. And we published the results at a conference that was held last year in Greece.
He also won the best paper.
And he won the best paper. And the funny thing about that is they still haven't sent me the award. Mm-hmm. It's a plaque, plus I think some $100 or whatever it is. They still haven't sent it to me. So, any questions so far? I mean, you're free to interrupt me as I'm talking. So I'm just going to show some examples of, I'm going to focus on medical stuff. Some stuff I've done, some stuff I haven't, but it just kind of highlights, where these things are going, at least in North America. So this is from some work being done at Stanford. I'm not involved with this, of course. And this is just an interesting thing. So the heart is a complicated three-dimensional organ. It's really hard to describe what's going on inside of it. And how do medical trainees learn about the heart? They look at books. They look at books and images on the web. They're not 3D though, right? They're 2D. So you're taking a 3D model and you're projecting it onto a 2D page. And virtual reality eliminates a lot of that complexity by letting people go inside the heart and see what's happening themselves. It's worth way more than 1,000 words. And this is according to Dr. David M. Axelrod. He's an assistant professor of pediatric cardiology at Stanford University. And what they do is they've actually used the HTC Vive and virtual reality to view the heart. And it's allowing the trainees to actually, instead of just looking at a 2D projection of a 3D model, they're actually the 3D heart, they're looking at the actual heart. And they're able to see things that they can't by just flipping through pages. And it's helping them become, better. This this is an old project too, but I'll show it anyways. This was some work that some undergraduate students did with when the Microsoft, this was a Kinect first came out. And this was with, we did it with the doctor, that guy there, John. He was a rehab doctor, and he injured his own shoulder. He was a kayaker, and he injured his shoulder. And he came up with this device. It's called the spin core. It's a physical device, and he has a number of exercises that you do with it, and it helps rehabilitate your shoulder. What he found was that after using the device for a little bit, people stopped. His patients stopped. So what we did was created an immersive experience that basically took the device, the spin core they called it, and we made it as part of our game mechanic in a, well, you'll see, right? And this was done by undergraduates, just in an undergraduate course. So basically, there should be a little video popping up. So we're just basically taking the motions as the user is using the spin core, it's being mapped into the game. Some other work with plastic surgeons that we've done, kind of going here chronologically. This was looking at the Z-plasty procedure, and it's basically a way to fold the skin so that you limit scarring when you have a cut or that type of thing. And we did this work with a plastic surgeon, in Canada. And then again, it's a very difficult procedure to teach the basics, the cognitive aspects. So how you do the incision, you have to basically make a Z. But it's very hard to get angles and things like that. So you'll get a feel of it. So again, it's just to teach the basic cognitive aspects of the procedure. And this again is fairly old work too. So yeah, I won't go through the whole thing. This is a little more recent. Here we recreated this was one of the students, a PhD student actually. What he did was he created a framework. What his thing is created a framework to allow you to develop these virtual experiences easily. So what happens is a lot of these things come and they're one scenario, right? Well, with this framework, it lets you edit the scenario in a very simple manner. So you can create different scenarios. So one of the things we were focusing on, at least in this example, was heart surgery. And, why settle just for heart surgery? Why not? Why replicate things? Why do a separate, sim for, brain surgery? Well, with this framework, it allows you to actually reuse common elements and recreate different scenarios. And the nice thing, what we did with this thing too, was we used it for research studies where we're able to vary the fidelity, various simulation parameters, like the levels of visual fidelity, auditory fidelity. So we can run studies to determine how that affects learning. This is some work we did with anesthesiologists, looking at the epidural procedure. And again, looking at the cognitive aspects. So before you perform an epidural procedure, there's some things you have to do. Like you have to look at the chart, make sure it's the right patient, a whole bunch of things you have to do. Step-by-step procedure, you have to make sure you wash your hands. These are trivial things, but they're often overlooked. And it becomes very important that, trainees, constantly practice this. So we're continuing this work, actually. We ran some studies with anesthesiology trainees. What we're doing now is we're actually putting the physical component within it and actually physically simulating with a haptic device the insertion of the epidural itself. So what's that? Looking at eye exams. Again, this is work with one of my colleagues. This is work with Alvaro Fabrizio. Looking at eye fundoscopy. So looking at the eye using your ophthalmoscope. And this work, one of our master's students is wrapping up. Virtual patients, so this is more recent stuff. One of the things, a big part of VR and what have you is really simulating patients. And when you simulate patients, it becomes simulating how a human behaves. It becomes it's very difficult because when a person is talking to when a patient is talking to a doctor, I mean, when you have communications with someone, what is it that you look at? What if I'm talking to you? I mean, I get a feel of how you are by looking at your facial expressions. Right now, I see everyone falling asleep and angry that they're here now. So it becomes difficult. There's eye contact. You want to maintain eye contact. If you're a doctor, you want to look at the patient in the eye. You want to express empathy. You want to show that you're in tune to their emotions. Replicating that, it's easy for us to do. I can get a good feel of whether you're angry or sad or happy for the most part. But having a virtual, an avatar, a virtual patient do that becomes very difficult. So that's a big growing area. So, when you're using virtual patients, you can think of, if you look at psychiatry, for example, or therapy, mental therapy of any sort, you have a patient and you have a doctor or medical professional, therapist, there's dialogue and communication between them. And that dialogue progresses, the doctor's the response of the doctor and of the patient is going to depend on, the other's dialogue and their facial expressions and what have you. Okay? So virtual patients allow students to learn without putting real patients at risk. No actual patients are harmed in the process of learning from virtual patients. That's from a doctor at medical schools. And what we're doing here is we're creating a framework. I've recently started doing work in this domain. Framework to facilitate the creation of virtual patients and dialogue. To teach about verbal and nonverbal communications. So we're looking at eye contact, using eye trackers to determine where the user is looking at. Are they looking at the patient in the eye? We're looking at detecting emotions, happy, angry, sad, whatever the emotions may be. And then we're analyzing voice. So there's a lot of tools out there that let you analyze voice, and you can tell a lot about somebody's emotions just from their voice, tone of their voice, and that type of thing. So I think I have, this video just shows the dialogue. So this is actually work that Severio started doing, and we've actually just put together a conference article on this. He was looking at really kind of incorporating the dialogue, the voice, and he was using IBM Watson to determine emotions through voice. And he also put together an eye tracker, and he was able to determine where the person's gaze was, the user's gaze was. There's a heat map, shows you where the person was looking at in the scene. Obviously, you want to have eye contact, and we're able to put this together and kind of simulate a dialogue between a patient and a healthcare worker. That's ongoing work. Virtual patients, that's an area that I'm moving into. And if anyone wants to come to Canada, perhaps that's something that we can work on together and continue. If Fabrizio, something along those lines. This was Luca's work, which I mentioned earlier. But I mean, another area that we're looking at is interaction. And interaction could be hand movements in order to determine gestures and that type of thing. Or even just, interaction and looking at your fingers. So you want to be able to do, with respect to medical tasks, perhaps suture, or perhaps, use a scalpel to cut, those type of things. We want to be able to capture those really fine details and recreate those complex physical tasks. Luca, he basically created a device that allowed a user to reach objects within a range of movement of the upper limb in a manner similar to the real world. Couldn't do that with the HoloLens. And the whole point was that it avoided external tracking hardware, and it communicated wirelessly with the HoloLens. And the nice thing is, this involved software, but it also involved a lot of hardware. Luca 3D printed this, little box, and it held the electronics. Over here, you put together the electronics with some Arduino and other electronic components. So it was really a cool project, right? We put that together and we ran some preliminary studies. And okay. Another area that's that I'm very much interested in and doing a lot of work in is what's known as perceptual-based rendering. I'll explain what that is. But first off, we have this notion of fidelity. So how much realism is needed, right? As I pointed out earlier, video games, not too long ago, it was all focused on visual fidelity, like highly realistic graphics, right? Then the Nintendo Wii came along and we realized that, well, we don't really need all those, graphics, those high fidelity graphics. And there's more to a game or a virtual experience than just graphics, as the Wii pointed out. Keep in mind too, if you want high realism, there's a cost to pay because it's extremely computationally expensive. Even with the powerful computers we have today, if you want to have a very realistic scene that's high fidelity, it's going to tax your processor. You're going to need a very good computer, even today. And keep in mind that perfect multisensory fidelity. So we can't replicate everything. We can't replicate the real world. We just don't have the tech to do that. And if you don't believe me, think of smell, the sense of smell. Okay? Even if visuals are perfect, we can't mimic the sense of smell. And if you're looking at medical applications, medical professionals rely a lot on the sense of smell, believe it or not, right? So even surgeons, when they're in the operating room, they do rely on the sense of smell. They can tell a lot when they open you up, they can actually tell a lot about what's going on by the smell. We can't replicate that. We can do it very poorly, if any. So how much realism is needed to maximize learning? Do we need these very highly realistic scenes? Anyone willing to guess? Is that necessary? Yes? Who says yes? Who says no? Who doesn't care? The answer is it's still unknown, but what it seems to be is that it depends on the task and it depends on the learner, right? It depends on what you're trying to convey to the learner. If it's a surgeon who's been practicing, a very experienced surgeon who's been practicing for 20, 25 years, and they want to recreate a surgery that they're going to have, then you need that high, very high fidelity. But if it's a trainee, a surgical trainee, who just needs to know the basics of a procedure, then you don't need that high fidelity graphics. So it's kind of a scaffolding effect. And you also have to be aware of high realism. There's the uncanny valley effect, right? Where typical, you can create these very realistic, because our tech is not perfect, we create these humanoid, very realistic looking robots. And there's that line, they cross the line between realism and creepy, right? It becomes just very creepy. And in Japan, there's many examples of these robots, right? And one of the things too, we can have these highly realistic scenes, but if you look at just use surgery as an example, if you start cutting, really mimicking the flow of blood becomes very difficult, right? I mean, modeling blood and how it flows when you cut yourself, or an artery, for example, it becomes very difficult. So you can have this completely, highly realistic scene, operating room, and then all of a sudden you perform a task and it kind of just blows your immersion goes right down because it's not realistic at all. So within this work that I'm doing is I'm looking at investigating what's known as perceptual-based rendering. So can we use in the real world, we have our cues. There's multimodal cues. We have sight, we have sound, we have smell, the haptics, and they all come together. They all interact. And basically, with perceptual-based rendering, what you're doing is you're using one of the senses to compensate for another, essentially. Okay? So, in that case, so can I use sound to trick the visual perception system into thinking that the graphics are actually better quality than they actually are? And the answer is yes, you can. It's very complex, but you can. So we've conducted many experiments. I've done a lot of work in this domain. And I've looked at the effect of sound on visual fidelity perception and task performance. And also moving into the area of sound on haptic fidelity perception and task performance. So just as an example with sound and visuals, we started off with static images, 3D images, moved into dynamic environments, all kinds of graphical, defining fidelity in many different ways. And what we did was we had the user was tasked with rating their visual fidelity perception in the presence of various auditory sounds. And we ran many experiments, and what we found was that after conducting all these, sound can definitely have a large influence on visual fidelity, but it's very subjective. And this is really the key. It's subjective. So my notion of sound, or how I behave with certain sound, is going to differ from you guys. So what that has led us into moving into is customizing the interface and individualizing the interface. So this one-size-fits-all approach is not the greatest thing. Best is to have a customized interface. And again, how do you do that? Well, perhaps there's a little bit of a calibration process before you're using a sim, and the graphics and the sounds are tailored towards you based on some simple tests that you do. So that's a whole area that can be explored. So could be explained. So we've also explained a lot of this with cognitive load theory. Limited cognitive resources are available when someone tries to perform a task. When the cognitive load is low, a participant has a greater amount of cognitive resources available to allocate to a task, and it's possible that the availability of these cognitive resources leads to better performance. So what you can also do then is if your cognitive load increases as as there's more information coming into your senses, perhaps you can use VR to get your system used to these senses. Like if there's certain sounds in an operating room environment, perhaps before going into the operating room, you can get yourself accustomed to them. Okay, so there's some interesting work in here. Obviously, I'm just skimming the surface. And what we did found noise can be distracting in a simulation in the real world. Such distractions can be employed in a virtual learning environment. The trainees to focus during distracting moments. Right? So if there's noises and disturbances that happen, we can use VR to train the trainees with those disturbances, so that when they are encountered in the real world, they're not going to be such a problem, because their cognitive load is going to be lower. But is it all about viewing? As I pointed out, it's definitely not about viewing. Haptics is a big part and a growing part, because we now have devices, consumer-level devices, that can actually simulate haptics in the sense of touch. We've done a whole bunch of work, or not a whole bunch, but a number of experiments that have looked at using sound to trick. Well, what you have is these haptic devices currently are very expensive, the good ones, the high-fidelity ones. But we have some low-end gaming haptic devices. They're actually quite good, but they're not as high fidelity. So can we use sound to kind of compensate for the low-fidelity devices, and therefore have the user or the trainee think that the haptic fidelity is better than it actually is? So we did some work with that, and this is actually ongoing work where we used drilling. We simulated a drilling task. And what we did was we asked the users to drill using 3D printed. We had a Novit Falcon. It's a very cheap haptic device, actually a very good haptic device, cheap but good. And we 3D printed, it's not shown here, but we 3D printed a drill, and we had users simulating drilling through wood a certain distance in the presence of various auditory sounds. And we looked at how that affected their fidelity and their performance. So what we found there was, sound can influence haptic fidelity perception. It's fairly complex. Greater work remains. I'll leave it at that, just in the end of time. I'm going to skim through this very, very quickly. Designing immersive experiences. There's a lot of work involved, and it's interdisciplinary. Okay, but the good thing is that you guys, your skills are in demand. Okay, and whether it's in medicine, mining, whatever the case may be, your skills are really in demand. So think outside the box, right? And you have a lot of opportunities. There's a lot of open problems here. There's a lot of opportunities. Medicine is one area that's, at least in North America, it's a very growing area. And I know that our students, there's a lot of companies that do medical sims that have popped up that do medical sims and medical games and that type of thing for training. And even the hospitals, they're setting up virtual reality labs in the hospitals themselves. And a lot of it is to train the doctors, but a lot of it is also to train the patients on procedures. And we've worked with a number of doctors that are using VR to train patients, and kids in particular, not only kids, but kids. One example is the anesthesiologist that I'm working with. They have a sim to let the kids, kind of ease the kids into when they go for an MRI. And what they found was that when you have a kid experience, and I actually tried this, it's a very realistic, it feels like you're actually going in an MRI. It's very realistic. And it actually helps them because a lot of kids need to be anesthetized before they go into an MRI. But with the VR headset, it's actually reduced the number of kids that need anesthesia before going into an MRI. So it's very effective. Keep in mind that when you're dealing with developing these sims, there's a lot of work. And, I probably don't have to tell you guys, but it takes educational experts, it takes medical professionals if you're dealing with medicine, artists, the techies, us, and it can lead to problems because a lot of times even just communicating, right? When you're talking to a doctor, simulation may mean two different things to a doctor and a computer scientist. I had one student, summarize it nicely, and he said, the guy that worked on the knee game, or the knee sim, sorry, and he basically said that for him, it was just a matter of, I got in and I made it very clear to the doctors, they're not going to use Latin to me, and I'm not going to use tech jargon to them, right? It was kind of a funny way to deal with that. But, communication, right? Even that alone is very important. And also the doctors too, I remember with a lot of the stuff that I've done, it's like, I want this, list of 100 things, and I want it done in 1 week. And so you may get a piece of this and a piece of that, and maybe a little piece of that, and you'll get it in a year. So expectations too, right? Yeah, so I'll skip through that. So moving forward, show me the proof. One of the things that needs to be done, we need greater evidence of effectiveness. And we need more studies. There are some studies, but we need more studies to show, at least in medicine, that this stuff really works. It works in VR, in sim, and for fighter pilots or pilots in general, but we need evidence for medicine because medicine is very evidence-based. And this is not easy to do because running experiments with medical professionals and surgeons and what have you is very time-consuming, and they're busy. They have clinical commitments, so it becomes very difficult. Like we're running some studies now, but again, it just takes such a long time. Getting ethics approval from the hospitals is not easy, etc. But keep in mind too that the current generation of learners, they're really challenging our current and outdated, learning techniques. Having a professor sit in front of the board writing mathematical equations just doesn't cut it. It's boring. I look at myself, and if I'm sitting in front of a lecture, I can only take, my attention span is very small. I don't want to do that. But if I'm doing something and I'm experiencing it, obviously it goes, you change. Maybe my lecture is going to be a little more exciting, right? And if I'm being no, mine too. It's 20, 30 minutes. How much is your attention span? Sometimes I teach 3 hours. I feel sorry for the students. But of course, it's not only about the technology. We have to think about how we use the technology. So we have to really think about what it is we want to accomplish. Okay, so we have to make sure that we do a proper needs and task analysis. What is it that we're trying to do? How are we going to do it? Who are our users? Are they, male adolescents in university? Are they, female housewives? Whatever the case, you have to consider your audience. That becomes very important. Proper design is required, and that's what's lacking in a lot of these things. So a lot of the games that have been used for education and training, or a lot of these sims, there's a lot of them, but not all of them are effective. Now the problem is they're not effective because they haven't been designed properly. And that's really bad because what happens if somebody uses a game or a sim that's not designed properly, not effective, then they kind of just throw the whole area away instead of just saying this is a bad example. Okay, so it's you guys are going to build this stuff. Make sure you design it properly, otherwise it's going to do harm to the field. And of course, so technology will continue to improve. Imagine the opportunities in 5 years, let alone 10 or 15. Just think of the past 10 years, what has happened. It's definitely not linear. It goes, technology improves more exponentially. Electronic skin or e-skin, soft bendable and wearable tech that allows the user to manipulate objects that exist only in the real world, in the virtual world, sorry. There's a lot of things that are coming out, right? And think about, 5 to 10 years from now. I have a video here, but I won't show this. It's a little Microsoft if you've seen it. But there's cool stuff everywhere. IBM Watson Q&A computer system capable of answering questions posed in natural language. Just for example, you can detect emotions with it and natural language processing. And it's only improving as computing power gets better and AI techniques evolve. Things are only getting better. So, I mean, I look at a lot of the stuff that I want to do now, even if I can't do them, I know in not even 5 years, but say in 5 years, I will be able to, right? And I'll be able to do it cheaply and things will be even smaller. This is another very interesting area, makerspaces, coupling simulation with makerspaces. And this is some work I'm doing with a medical person on my university who's interested in simulation on the fly. So if you want to couple virtual reality, and let's say he needs to mimic, a joint of some sort. Well, you 3D print it quickly and you couple it with virtual sims and augmented reality, and you're able to train for a specific scenario, on the fly. This Boston Children's Hospital. Oh, sorry, I'm actually going here. They have a simulator program engineering worker space. So again, they've actually done something similar where they've coupled. They have, some great maker spaces, and by maker space I mean 3D printing, electronic components, things like that. So that's a really big area for students. And again, here's the that work that I talked about earlier, the drill. This is actually a surgical drill that we 3D printed, and stethoscope that we've done some work with hard stuff. Okay, so I think what I'll do is I'll end it with this, just food for thought, I guess. Chocolate-covered broccoli and Brussels sprouts. So you don't just make an activity fun by throwing some coding over it, right? And this goes back to the design. When we're designing these things, or we have to make sure we actually design any virtual sim that you're creating or any game you're creating, you really have to take the time and do your design and your needs and task analysis, right? So you have to really look at the problem. What is it you're trying to solve? Who are my learners, or who are my users, potential users, and what am I going to do to solve it? And on that note, actually, I like to say it's not the end, right? Because there's more work. There's a lot of work to be done, but more work equals opportunity for you guys and for us. And I'll just end with one quote: "We don't stop playing because we grow old. We grow old because we stop playing." This was George Bernard Shaw. It's in English. I can't remember exactly, but I think that summarizes it. And just one last thing. This was a think tank session that was done in Toronto with Microsoft sponsored the event, and they actually put together this. It's specific to Canadian healthcare, but they brought together engineers, computer scientists, and more medical folks, and they looked at this whole thing on the future of mixed reality and immersive tech in healthcare. You can find the document that was created. It's actually on my LinkedIn. I don't know if it might be on the Microsoft site too. But on that note, thank you.
Thank you, Bill, for this inspiring talk. Do you have questions, sir? We have some time for questions. I have several questions, but I would like you to make the first step. It's your turn.
I agree with Professor was really inspiring speech, and some of the study was very, very interesting. A question about maybe AI-related tasks, and you mentioned in the first slide or in the former slide that some challenges are open about also the real procedure, real surgical procedure, because of course a simulation is about then projecting to real procedures.
Yeah.
So, but I think that one of the challenges that is very crucial to the adoption of the AR technology in the real environment is about the tracking of the patient, which is maybe in a simulation could be tricky.
So what do you mean by tracking of the patient?
Yeah, in the AR environment, you should superimpose in a very accurate way the information, and maybe tracking the patient is the most
Absolutely.
important.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. Yeah.
My question is, you think that the technology is moving more from keeping the technology on the device that is wearing the doctor, so putting markers and so on, or is quite, I don't know, feasible to expect that in the near future some tracking device will be embedded and provided with medical
So I think a bit of both, but
device.
I like to think more. I think more on the embedded within the device, because I mean, when you have codes and those don't work. Well, I mean they work, but they're limiting, right? So that's what I think. I think like I mean, if you look at the medical devices, at some point they'll all be sensors, or they'll all have sensors embedded in them. It's just a matter of time. We can do that, but I think it's just a matter of time before that actually happens. We have the tech to do that. We can embed sensors in pretty well any medical device, right? I mean, things are small enough that we can do that. And then everything can be, we can project onto anything, or we can use anything to track and that type of thing. So I mean, even the scalpels, like I mean, there's no reason why you can't embed. You can track them. You can keep track of where they are, and so yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Of course, the patient can also change his shape during the procedure, so maybe it's really challenging right now to.
Right. I mean, there's challenges right now. There's no question, right? And actually getting those subtle details. I mean, because I mean, with a procedure, there's so many things that can happen, right? And every patient's going to be different. So you have to know about the patient. I mean, really, I mean, because how I behave, if you take a cut, what if I'm taking blood thinners, for example? If I take a cut, it's not. If I get cut, it's not going to heal us, or it's not going. The blood's not going to stop as fast as you who are not taking blood thinner. So just as an example, there's a lot of things that you have to know beforehand. If you want a very realistic simulation, these are things you have to account for. So you do have to know about the patient and have information about the patient and that type of thing. And then you have to account for those things, but they're not easy. But that's where AI can come in, right? And you can have these intelligent patients, for example, through learning. So there's a lot of interesting, creating even just intelligent patients is a task, right? And it's very difficult. But there's so many factors that need to be accounted for. Yeah, good question.
So there was a slide that you were talking about creating patients that doctor can actually
The virtual patients.
Get the feelings and etc. So for creating each patient, someone has to take time and create that individual patient, and everybody is going through the
No.
learn.
I mean, you could do it that way, but the whole thing is to incorporate AI and machine learning techniques so that the patient adapts and learns accordingly, right?
So you can actually generate new patients from the.
Yeah, absolutely. Right now, I mean, and this is preliminary work, so yeah, we create the patient, and it's but there's no reason to say that you can't have an interface that lets you create a patient. Perhaps with some statistics that you're able to incorporate, and then the AI agent takes over.
So isn't that a problem when you generate with AI, and then there would be a ground truth that you need, which you need to train actually the guy. So where would that ground truth come?
Yeah, that comes from actual. So what we're using here is actual patient-doctor scenarios and dialogues that we have. So, I mean, yes, ultimately it has to learn from somewhere, right? And these were given to us, the work that we've done, it was actually given from psychiatrists that we work with. There's actually books on scenarios and there's all kinds of books. But yeah, I mean, the training becomes an issue too, absolutely. It's not perfect. Yeah, but that's good, right? Because then there's work.
One other question. And one thing I was missing here was that there's a doctor who is training in the system using these technologies. How would you evaluate that the training was effective?
So I never talked about that, but that's actually a very good question. And there's a number of things that you can do. We keep track, in-game statistics. So what it could be time, depending on the sim we're actually looking at. Time is one of them. We look at what they've done, the route they take, so there are metrics that we have that come from the doctors themselves as to whether they're doing it right or wrong. So we definitely look at that. And the other thing I didn't talk about here, at the end, what you get is scorecards. So there's a scorecard, and that forms part of the debriefing process. So there should be a debriefing that comes after this stuff, and then you look at what you did wrong and why you did it wrong. But ultimately, those are metrics that come from the medical professionals, right? So it's not up to us to determine whether they did it right or wrong. They give us the metrics. This is how it should be done, and we look at how far they, depending on what they're doing. So with the knee gain, for example, you have to pick some tools for each step. Well, I mean, what we did there was if you pick the correct tool, then you get a check mark, and you did this step right. If you didn't, then it's like go back and repeat, and you give them hints. Again, that's all given by the medical professionals.
But actually finding that out, which the learning was positive in the real world, is that also a possibility, or just?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, in the real world, how do they do it? They videotape. They have somebody looking over them. There's different ways to do it. You can actually look at it and go back after and debrief, just like you can do in a sim. Or you can have somebody point out mistakes as you're doing them, like on the fly. Just depends on but you can definitely do all that stuff. But it's really important to have a mechanism where you record stuff. And with Sims, it's nice because you can record all the gameplay, right? Or say gameplay. You can record it all in game and then look at it after as part of the debriefing process. But the debriefing is extremely important. So I can't emphasize that enough.
He's one of our PhD students working on AI and machine learning.
Okay.
It seems that he's willing to work also on virtual reality simulation.
That whole area of creating virtual patients is, and I showed them one example where you're having dialogue, but then there's also creating, intelligent patients that are in the operating room. How do they react to what the surgeon does? That's a whole, or what the healthcare person does when they cut, whatever the case may be. So there's a whole open area in that domain as well, where you can apply AI and machine learning. These are open; they're open fields, but there's room. So,
a question about the immersion and about the experience in general. Let's imagine that I am a student and I'm taking a course or a lesson with the VR.
Mm-hmm.
But what if I can't? I can stand the experience. What if I don't feel good while using?
So again,
is there any?
That's a very valid, an excellent question. And again, I didn't touch on it here. So there are going to be some people, and even when you're dealing with games, there's going to be some people that just don't like it. So you have to have other approaches. You have to have, you can't just say use the game or use the sim. You may get motion sickness. A small percentage of the people I get motion sickness. I actually do this stuff, but I get sick if I use it. So I can't use it. I can do some of it, but I do get motion sickness. So you always have to have choices and alternatives. Absolutely. Again, I didn't talk about it here, but those are things that you have to account for. I mean, if you're giving this to, maybe a fighter pilot, they don't get motion sick, but the average person will get motion sickness. So you have to be able to, you have to account for that when you're designing and try to limit the amount of motion sickness that's going to occur. But some people just don't like this stuff and they don't want to use it. So I think you always have to have, and this is not just me saying it, it's even in, it's documented. You have to have multiple options, or you have to have options for somebody that can't. And the other thing, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. The other thing that's lacking with a lot of this stuff is making sure that these are, what do you call it? The word is inclusive. So in other words, if somebody's blind, for example, they can't use a VR headset, obviously. So you have to make sure that the VR, and this is another whole open area, making sure that these are accessible. That's the word, accessibility. You have to make sure that somebody who can't use their arms can still go in and interact with this. For example, if you're using gestures, hand gestures, or if somebody can't hear, well, then you can maybe use visuals. Or if somebody can't see, you have to use you have to compensate for that. So there's a lot of issues that can prevent a lot of people from using them. The other thing this is actually a great question, because the other thing that you have to also consider is there's ethical issues here too that we're not really considering, that really anybody considers. But if you talk to the medical folks, I talked to some of the medical people, and we've had some discussions on this. What are the issues with having somebody use this for 4, 5, 6 hours? Can they go drive after? Are there going to be issues with driving? What's it going to do to their vision? These are still open areas, right? I mean, there's some data like NASA back in the 80s, If you were taking part in an experiment, a VR experiment, you had to sign a form that you wouldn't drive for 24 or 48 hours or something like that. We don't do that now. So I mean, people can come in and do these experiments, use these headsets, and then they're going out and driving. Is that morally wrong? Is it ethically wrong? I mean, I don't know, but we're doing it. So yeah, these are great questions, and I don't have complete solutions aside from saying that you have to offer, or you should offer, different choices. And some people just don't like it, and that's fine.
We talked about virtual patients. What about virtual training? So in the sense, like,
Yeah, so-
education, where especially in the medical field, where
Yeah.
body posture, how you move your
So in other words, the patient talks to a virtual doctor.
exactly. And
That's also, I didn't talk about that.
Important.
It's very important. And you know, the interesting thing on that was they've done studies with that, and they've shown that a patient that talks to a virtual doctor is more likely to be honest and say, we're talking about psychiatry and psychotherapy or therapy here. They're more honest, and they're more, they say more, I'll just say more to the virtual doctor than to the real doctor. Because they know that it's not an actual doctor there, but it's a representation, a virtual. And they're more they're honest, and they're more telling. They're willing to say more. So it's the same thing. In that case in that case, you still have to, it's kind of the opposite, but you still have to keep track of where the person is looking at and what have you. Good point. So even though I never talked about it, it's equally as important.
And it was a little bit slightly different, but it's nice to have it. I was more thinking of an instructor to a medical student.
Yeah.
So does it make it a lot different of seeing a procedure on a set of slides, or actually see a virtual
So
student
again,
doing it?
different
learning transfer.
That's an interesting thing, and that's one of the things that I've actually wanted to do. So one of the things we've done is we've created this gamified educational network where we're looking at the difference between, and I'm doing this with medical folks, looking at the difference between actual things that are exactly that, taking actual procedures versus simulated or virtual procedures, and looking at what the differences are with that. It depends on I think it depends on the task and what it is you're doing. Sometimes it doesn't matter. But if you need that fine detail, then more than likely the real will be. But that's an open area too. Yeah.
Here's another PhD student working with Andrea. So they are looking for inspiration.
Those are some really good stuff. Some great ideas. Yeah, summer camp. Yeah, not winter. No.
I'm looking for inspiration. So they ask, is it feasible? Is it interesting? So
Yeah, no, that's great. But all these are good. These are open questions. Everything you guys are asking is open.
what is nice is that we are working on a real, many overlaps.
Oh, yeah.
You are doing and they are doing. So that's nice.
Okay, so Massimo Ignorini from Links Foundation, not anymore a student, unfortunately, but we're always student, always learn.
Yeah. Some of us never leave the university, right?
Exactly. Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. It was very nice. I would just, I want to point out some aspects that maybe are partially emphasized, but I think that are relevant. By the way, we work at Links Foundation on the different kind of training, virtual training, which is more related to emergency management, so civil protection, firefighters, and other kind of stuff,
Yeah.
which is a huge, as
Of course.
and there are basically three further advantages that can, be added to the one you already mentioned. The first was already mentioned by Michael Lecter, was the assessment, the capability to assess the trainee. And this is the fact that you can always, at any time, in any second, assess each one, even if you have a team there. It's really huge.
Yeah, you can collect all kinds of data too, right? You have a lot of data. I mean, what you do with it is a whole other thing, but you can.
Is this something-
And also physiological data. You can measure EEG and heart rate and
That's what-
GSR. So yeah.
This is something you cannot actually do in reality, at least unless you use brackets or something like this.
Yeah.
And you cannot imagine the structure being on the shoulder of everyone at any second. So this is something where virtual reality does not want to reproduce the world, but can improve.
Improve. Good point. Yeah. Yeah. That's a very good point.
Second thing, it's the presence of dangerous substances or to specific constraints. For example, when you have to perform an exercise, a trial into tunnels,
Yeah.
for fire, for example, accidents, you have to stop the tunnel.
Yeah.
This is another point which is very, very huge because you know, not the traffic or you.
Yeah, and money
For example, in winter they cannot exercise because of the water being becoming ice and
Too cold, yeah.
to private sport. And the third point, which is very clear to me, is the figure of dungeon master. You know what the passionate with role playing games called dungeon masters. Basically, you can within the simulation you can always adjust the simulation depending on what the team or the single needs in the team, right? No? So
Those are excellent points, yeah.
this is something that when you, for example, perform an exercise, a long exercise, you cannot do it in your head because this is already planned and that's it.
Yeah.
And this is another advantage that, in my opinion, is very big because.
Yeah, that leads to this whole, that's a great points, especially that last one. You get into stealth learning and dynamic adjustment. So you can actually you can constantly assess the player without them even knowing it and adjust the level of the difficulty on the fly, so to speak. Great points, yeah. And there's probably many more good points, but yeah, that's absolutely. Thanks.
Justified.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I tell my students I teach a simulation course, a virtual sim course, and I give them the scenario where if you want to train emergency response to a nuclear bomb going off or a nuclear accident. I mean, you can't do that in the real world. You can only do it in simulation.
I mean, you can do one time.
You can do it one time, yeah. Yeah, and you
Right, you can.
you do it one time, exactly. Yeah,
You're right.
But it would be very costly. And probably make a lot of enemies. But yeah, so absolutely.
You can go in being in the aisle.
You want to escape afterwards.
Thank you for the talk. I was wondering if I were a medical student and I had to have like a simulation in virtual reality or mathematical, I would personally be like immersed into doing, for example, surgery or some other things. But I also believe that there will be like 3 levels. The real thing, the actual surgery, the experiment with physics simulation, for example, the mannequin, and the third one we analyzed. I would like to know if how much blurred are the lines among these 3, and if there are any statistics regarding the fact that maybe an immersive experience will be more like learned with that.
So yeah, that's that's actually an excellent question, and I don't have an answer for that because I'm not aware of an answer for it. This is something that needs to be done, and so this actually leads to where does, by no means am I saying that this is going to replace training. I'm not talking about medical training in general. It's not going to replace it. This is a tool that an educator has. It's one of the many tools that they have. And as we saw, I mean, some people may not want to use this, but it's one tool. One of the things that needs to be done, aside from what I mentioned earlier in the talk itself about, testing the effectiveness, thoroughly testing the effectiveness of this stuff with, proper medical trials when we're dealing with medicine, we have to also determine how this actually fits into the curriculum. And that becomes a very difficult thing. And exactly that. How much of this do we need? How much sim do we need with respect to real training, with respect to whatever? Those are open questions that need to be looked at. And these are things that I want to look at. But again, doing that is not trivial. It's actually very difficult because you're dealing with, ethics, you're dealing with a whole bunch of questions and what have you. But that's actually an open problem too. How does virtual sim, how does it fit into any curriculum for that matter? Where do you start off? Right now, I think it's good for novice trainees. I think you start off early and then you kind of build up and you move into the mannequins and then eventually into the actual training, emergency room or the operating room. But again, where does it fit in? The other thing too is how much practice do we need on a sim before you actually master the skill? Right? I mean, do you do it forever? Do you need 5 hours? Do you need 10 hours? Do you need, so those are open questions.
This is something that maybe has been already studied with mannequins.
With mannequins, there is some work with mannequins. Yeah, there is some work with mannequins. There's actually a lot of work with mannequins, but again, the sim, is it going to be the same?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking that could take like different statistics from these three different levels. For example, if you have to deal with a mannequin, you have people around you, your colleagues. Maybe that is a statistic you can have with an immersive experience.
Yeah, one of the things that, and I haven't seen this myself, not to say that it hasn't been done, and I do work with a medical simulation expert. He's one of the top guys in the field, and we've talked about this whole thing too, so he's not aware of it either. One of the things that will be, and again, it may be done, it may have been done, but it's kind of do a meta-analysis of exactly that. So how much, looking at the physical sims and how much time you need in the, I think that would be very useful. So, hey, there's a good time.
That's really a good question. And I think it's shown in all the questions and all your answers pointed out the fact that it's really a multidisciplinary
Absolutely.
job.
Yeah.
So
And I also look at myself and probably the majority of everyone
you're
here.
talking about statistics, you're talking about
That's right.
talking about machine learning and creating 3D content.
Yeah. And then tying it into a curriculum. I'm not an education expert, right? I mean, so this is the thing. We have the technical skills. We can build this up. We know the tech, we know that. But I'm not a medical professional. I'm not an educational expert. I mean, I picked up some things on education, but I'm not an expert, right? So that's the importance of working in an interdisciplinary team. This is not something that you're going to do alone. Doing a meta-analysis that I said, I mean, sure, I can probably do it, but I'm not an expert in analyzing, medical result, so you need the medical expert, so it is a very interdisciplinary thing. That's not a bad thing, right? I mean, it's a very good thing. But the nice thing about it is that even the medical people and the education experts, they actually need us more than we need them, right? I mean, so they really need our skill. So we're in a good position.
May I ask you, probably we are running out of time, so a quick question that may be relevant for all of us. How much do you think that modeling and animating is important? And so I think it's very labor-intensive. Creating new scenarios is very labor-intensive because there are also other stuff like designing the scenario, like making tests, etc. But also creating content is
It's
really
difficult.
a key part of this job. So do you think that the future, what's the future of this technology? What's the future of this kind of jobs? Because it's...
you're actually right. Modeling in the 3D animation for us is probably, or for me, I mean, the work that I do is probably the most difficult part, finding the appropriate students with that skill set.
will the future be that'll continue modeling by hand or?
So I don't think so. I think a lot of it will move to maybe AI, more smart, but right now it's still manual. Still a lot of it is manual. I'm just fortunate that I'm in a gaming program and we have students that actually have that skill, so we're able to do a lot of the stuff. But you're absolutely right, it's very labor intensive and it's a lot of time. What I do to ease the process a little bit is I try to buy as much models as I can. There's no point in creating these things from scratch. But some of them you do, you have to do yourself. Some of them are very specialized and you can't find models. The other thing, we picked up some scanners, some portable scanners that would let us scan a lot of this stuff, very high quality. I think it was one of them that you mentioned. But nonetheless, these high quality scanners that let us scan this stuff. But even those are going to require some work. We have some not so high quality scanners, and you can create a model, but you still have to, there's still holes and you have to fix it up. So that is a very labor intensive. But I think, moving into, I think in the future there will be a lot more intelligent AI taking a lot of that.
I think so, because otherwise you cannot manage the amount of requests that one receives from this.
Okay.
And at least by now, do you think that as technologists should have like some anatomic knowledge when modeling or like an artistic predisposition?
I mean, that's a good question. So obviously, if you're going to be modeling people in general, you should have some anatomical. I mean, of course, right? You're modeling a person, you should know a little bit of the. But you're not going to be an expert in that. You're not expecting to be an expert in that, right? I mean, but yeah, you should have a little bit of knowledge. I mean, I'm not an expert in medical stuff that I do, but I have a little bit of an idea of the task that I'm going to do because I think it helps me ultimately create this stuff. I'll give you an example. The U.S. military, they commissioned a gaming company to build a serious game, a game for training. The workers on a flight deck on an aircraft carrier. That's a very dangerous job. I was reading about this. These are the guys that guide the planes and but it's very dangerous, and they wanted to make sure that they're getting properly trained. What they did was, as part of the initial needs and task analysis, they sent the entire development team on an aircraft carrier for, I think it was 2 weeks. And they actually lived on the aircraft carrier, and they interacted with the people that did the job. But it was really interesting to note, and there was a video online that described this. So, I mean, they learned about flying planes on an aircraft carrier. Now, they're not pilots, they're not experts in that, or they're not experts in, I forget the name of those guys that actually work the platform, but they learned about it, and they saw them work, and that was the key. And the really interesting point, I remember this video clip, that they said that they had them, it's not they just went on the flight deck and observed and talked to the people that actually did the job. They went in and they talked to the chefs and the cooks in the kitchen. And this was interesting. They did that because the crew spends a lot of time in the kitchen. They eat, and they talk to the chefs. And they tell them stories about what happened on the deck. So the cooks and the chefs, or the kitchen staff, were conveying those stories to the developers. So again, that's thinking beyond just talking to the person that's going to use it. It's talking with people that are, talking to the cooks, because those guys spend a lot of time in the kitchen and they tell stories. So it's really thinking above and beyond, right? I mean, it's thinking outside the box and really trying to get a good story of what's going on. So I mean, the stories that the flight deck workers were telling the cook, could be stuff that was related to accidents, things that happened, that they almost got killed today because this wires, whatever. But those are things that maybe the developers wouldn't see in the span of 2 weeks, but they find out about it by talking to the kitchen staff. So, again, are those guys experts in doing that job? No, but they learn a little bit about it so that it helps them with their tasks. So if you want to design models and patients and do animations and move body parts, you should have a little knowledge of in my belief, right? You should have a little knowledge on the bone structure, or on our anatomical structure. Any more questions?
Last question. We have. I don't know if someone will ask us.
Oh, yeah.
That's right.
So you talk about advantage of applying virtual reality and augmented reality in training, but from your view, there are also negative aspects or common mistake to avoid for during the design. For
Yeah, so
that come from gaming development. So feature, for example, how much the game or experience is challenging, or
great question. I mean, there's definitely disadvantages. Aside from there's this, first of all, the tech is not perfect. So there's going to be disadvantages, and some of the disadvantages relate to, motion sickness and things we've already talked about. In terms of the design, I think the biggest disadvantage is lack of design. So that's the biggest thing, that design is not a big part of the thing. And what happens is, and I'm guilty of this too, I'm not saying I'm any better. We as developers, first thing we do is we want to develop a game to teach surgeons about this, whatever this is. We jump right into code. When in fact we should step back and we should learn about the task. We should spend a couple of months, or whatever, I don't know what the timeline is, but spend some time learning about the task, do a background search, what has been done, even looking at what games have been built or sims have been built already to help that task, or to help a task similar to it. And then if there is something similar, you don't want to recreate, reinvent the wheel, so to speak. But then, it doesn't mean that you can't do something better and improve it, right? Because chances are there's going to need, so take what's out there already and analyze it. What are the good things about it? What are the bad things about it? So really get to know the problem, get to know what, if any, solutions are out there and what limitations they have, and move into there. The other thing that I think that we underestimate is, and I think these are things we pointed out earlier, but I'm looking at the cost, because there's a cost involved, and animating the models can become expensive in terms of time in particular. So, and especially when, you guys as students, you also have other commitments, right? You have classes and what have you. So that's a big part. The other part too is even just, the scope of the thing, learning. So what is it that you want to do, right? I mean, so looking at the scope and not going beyond what you have to do, because again, time and money and what have you. So I think really the biggest, in terms of the design aspect, it's the lack of design. I think I can't stress that enough. It's really important to really do the proper needs and task analysis, and really know what your objective is. Why are you building this sim or this game? And I think that's one thing that we don't do. And you know, what's the purpose? What are you doing? And what's your result? What's your end goal? What's your aim? So that's the most important thing. And I can't stress that enough because it's really lacking. So if there's bad examples of games or sims, it's because they haven't been properly designed, not because the field is flawed or anything. So, and there's another question too. So. Yeah.
Yeah, inclusive design.
Oh.
We spoke about good design products, and do you have some advices on validating your design before design?
That's an excellent question. Yeah. That is so what we do. I mean, so in terms of validating the design. So okay, well, there's two things you can look at. I mean, one, you have to make sure that the content is correct, right? I mean, because that's part of the design as well, and that's going to happen with the content experts and the educators. So the content and how it's being conveyed. Now, the other thing, in terms of validating, there's also, aside from the content, and you know, because the content is not, you don't have anything to do with the content, right? That's the content experts. The other thing that you could do is, I like, even before, so let's assume we have that part done, and the content is fine. Then what I like to do is build prototypes, right? So kind of an agile kind of development process where you build prototypes and you do usability testing. And you do the usability testing because there's also, aside from the content and what it is and the educational aspects, there's also the interface, right? And how are users going how are you going to lay out your interface? I mean, how are you doing that? So you can do that with prototyping, and you can follow existing guidelines, right? If there's HCI kind of guidelines that you can follow. Who are your audience? Are they older? Well, if they're older, then maybe you want to use bigger text, or like things, general things that you can follow. But I think the important thing to do is really prototype and do usability testing along the way, like multiple times. So I try to do, again, it takes time to do that, but at least you want to get a couple rounds of usability testing with maybe two versions. I mean, even one version, and then before you kind of finalize things. So we do that, and what we do is the usability testing. You don't even need a lot of. I mean, there's studies out there that show most usability problems can be found with, I think it's 5 to 7 or 3 to 5. I can't remember exactly, but a small number of participants that have knowledge in user interfaces and that type of thing. So what I do is I do my first round of usability testing with game development students or computer scientists, HCI people, because they're going to focus on the interface. And then I'll do a next round of usability with people that are going to use it, so the medical people. But again, I'm not looking at effectiveness. I'm only looking at usability. How are the sounds good? Are the graphics later? Like things like general. And there's standard questionnaires you can use. I use there's a system usability scale. There's a whole bunch of them that you can look at. So those I think are in terms of before. Those are things that you can definitely.
I think that you need to go to Canada to continue the discussion.
Yeah.
It's happening tomorrow. You're not going to Canada now, so.
I'm going to Greece, but I can always come back.
Yeah, you can go.
Or you can go to Greece. Yeah, you can go to Greece.
I'm sure they will like it.
There's good olives in Greece. Right. By the way, I had an Italian Greek pizza yesterday.
Yes. Nice pizza. So, you probably pizza.
Yeah, it's sold. Yeah.
You sold. Okay.
So hopefully I answered your questions, and so actually very good questions.
Mm-hmm. But many of them are actually working on simulations, maybe on different topics than yours.
Yeah.
But of course, they are facing exactly the problem. They are at different stage of their development, but they are asking. She is, for instance, working on. She is wondering whether what is going to produce is actually what the company is expecting. So she's a concrete problem. So. Okay.
Yeah, and of course I'm talking about medical stuff here, but it doesn't mean it can apply to anything, right? It's design is design, whether you're doing medicine or mining or.
The point is that what if they can you get the commitment from the domain experts? So because the point
that's hard.
That's hard.
Yeah. But the nice thing about medical guys is that especially the surgeons, they're very tech savvy and they love tech. So they're open, at least the surgeons that I've been working with, there's quite a few of them, they love this stuff. And I remember them they come to me and they say, hey, I got this one guy, anesthesiologist, he came to me and he said, hey Bill, I met him for the first time at a talk I gave. And he said, I bought an HTC Vive. Can you help me with it? You know, so I was like, yeah, sure. You know, so they're anything that can help them with their word. Like they're open. So they're an open group.
Thank you once again.